Hello, my name is Isabelle Kent. I am an art historian and curator specialising in Spanish art, and I also lecture for Art Pursuits. So I will have met some of you on our recent trip to Palma in Mallorca. But for those of you I haven't met, I thought this would be a nice opportunity to introduce myself and also to take a look at some really great art together. Now, the artist I'm going to be focusing on today is the greatest of the Spanish Baroque masters and one of the greatest painters in the history of art. He's often called the painter's painter, and that is, of course, Diego Velazquez. Now, I can't cover all of Velazquez's long career and all his many masterpieces in just one short talk, so I thought I'd focus on one artwork in particular. And that is a painting called The Spinners, or Las Hilanderas, as it's known in Spanish. But it also sometimes goes by another title, and that title is the Fable of Arachne. And it's these two very different titles in this work of art that I want to be looking at and delving into why this painting has two such different identities and interpretations. So without further ado, let's get started. The Spinners was painted in the last few years of Velazquez's life. It's thought of as one of his last masterpieces. Velazquez dies in 1660, and so it was probably painted between 1657 and his death. And what I want to do first is just look closely at the painting itself, and in particular look at the two different spaces in the painting. In the foreground is a dimly lit and quite crowded room full of women hard at work. And then in the background you have a much lighter space. Sunlight seems to be streaming in from the left-hand side, and it's decorated with these beautiful, lavish tapestries. So I'm going to start off with the foreground room, and this is the room that gives the painting its name, The Spinners. There are 5 women in this room, and 3 of them are clearly hard at work at various steps of the process to make thread. And the first of these women is the one right in the middle, wearing the red skirt, and she is very loosely painted. So loosely, in fact, that you can't really see the expression on her face. And what she's doing is she has a comb in her hand, and then with the other hand she's leaning down to pick up some rough wool. And so what she'll be doing is combing so that all of the fibres of the wool come apart and then it can be spun. The next stage in the making of thread is the spinning itself, and you have this older woman sitting by a spinning wheel, deftly feeding the wool into the spinning wheel and turning it into thread. And she clearly knows how to do this so well that she's able to hold a conversation with an assistant behind her, an assistant who's sort of pulling back a red curtain. And the third woman in the process, the final stage, is this young woman on the right, and she is incredibly elegant, and she's deftly taking the thread from a skein that looks like cobwebs, and rolling it into a ball in her other hand. And she appears very sensuous. Velazquez is clearly delighted in the painting of the back of her neck and of her beautiful outstretched arm. And it reminds me of a painting that Velazquez made just a few years earlier, and that is the Rokeby Venus, Velazquez's only nude. And the Rokeby Venus is in the National Gallery, and you have the same angle of looking at a woman from behind, and the same nape of her neck showing. And I wonder if it were the same model in both cases that Velazquez is using. And then the final figure is another assistant, just coming through the door, or perhaps about to leave the door, and it's unclear if she's picking up a basket to take finished thread away, or perhaps bringing an empty basket in. And there are other details in this scene as well. So you have this big mass of fleece tacked to the wall, and then you have lots more scraps of wool all over the floor, and there's a cat sitting contentedly amongst it all. And there's also this ladder that is propped against the back wall, possibly it's a ladder that might be used to hang tapestries. For many centuries, it was this scene that was the main focus of the painting and of the analysis of this painting. And it's this scene that gives the painting its name, The Spinners. It was seen as a simple depiction of women at work making thread. It's virtuosic in terms of the handling of paint, but it was thought that there was nothing deeper in the subject. And for many, this confirmed Velazquez as an artist fascinated by naturalism, depicting real people taking part in real everyday activities. And there's much to be said for this interpretation. Velazquez was undoubtedly an artist who was fascinated by naturalism, and you see this in all of his art, whether it be in the portraits of Philip IV and his family, or in his earliest works, these paintings that he made in Seville that are referred to as bodegones, or tavern scenes. And in these he would paint real people, working class people, and really indulge in getting the texture of their skin and the texture of the ceramics on the table and the food. But if we go back to the Spinners, there's more to it than just a scene of women working. It was only in the mid-20th century that scholars took a closer look at that scene in the background, what had always just been thought of as a room displaying tapestries and therefore displaying the finished product that these women were working towards when they were spinning thread. And these scholars, they looked closely, and by doing this they unlocked the truth behind this painting. So let's take a look at this scene in the background, this light-filled space. So on the left-hand side, you have a woman wearing a helmet, and her arm is raised, and she seems to be looking across at the woman in white and green with this red sash, and that woman's arms are kind of held apart, and it looks as if they're arguing. And then you have these three other women who seem to be onlookers, observers, and one of them is looking directly out at the painting at the viewer, as if inviting us in to look more closely. And these two central figures have been identified as Minerva and Arachne. Minerva is the Roman goddess of wisdom and of craft, and also of warfare, hence the helmet. And Arachne was a mortal woman who was an exceptional weaver and maker of tapestries. And the story, as related in Ovid's Metamorphoses, is that Arachne is boasting of her skill, and someone says, "Oh yes, you're so skilled that you were taught by Minerva." And she says, "No, the skill is all mine. I am greater even than Minerva." And of course the goddess overhears this, and so she disguises herself as an elderly woman and goes to Arachne and says, "You should apologise, you should beg forgiveness from the goddess." And Arachne says, "Of course I won't do that, I am greater than her, and if she thinks she's so good, why doesn't she compete with me?" And so then of course Minerva whips off her disguise, and the two have this competition. Minerva weaves a tapestry depicting all these great deeds of the gods, the triumphs of the gods. And in response, Arachne weaves a tapestry depicting the various misdeeds of the gods, and in particular these misdeeds that I think we all know so well of Zeus disguising himself and tricking young, beautiful women. And Arachne's tapestry is faultless. Minerva knows this, and she's so furious that this is such a great tapestry that she confronts Arachne and punishes her by turning her into a spider. And what we have here is that moment of anger from Minerva, her raising her arm about to strike Arachne. This choice to have the mythological subject matter right in the background of the painting is a really unusual one for Velazquez to have made, and it's something that has puzzled people for a long time. Because most history paintings, that is, paintings with subject matter that is mythological or historical or religious, those paintings would put that subject front and centre and make it really legible and really clear. And that's for quite a simple reason. because history painting was seen to be the most prestigious type of painting you could make. There was a hierarchy of the genres, and history was right up the top, and then you'd have portrait below it, and landscape, and still life going down, and being less respected. So if you were commissioned to make a history painting, you would want people to know it. But Velazquez doesn't do that at all. Instead, he chooses to emphasise the everyday scene, the scene of the spinners in their studio, what might be called a genre scene. And the reason for Velazquez doing that is quite a complicated one, and it's what I want to look at now. And to understand this, we have to go back and look at Velazquez as a man and as an artist in the context of his time. Velazquez was interested in experimenting with genre and space from the very earliest point in his career. And you can see that in this painting, Christ in the House of Martha and Mary, which he painted when he was just 20 years old. You have two working women in the foreground preparing a meal, and then through this window you have a biblical scene, which is Christ speaking to Martha and Mary. And so again, Velazquez has chosen to put what most artists would think of as the most important part of the painting in the background. When Velazquez arrives at court in 1522 and he becomes painter to Philip IV, he moves away from this kind of painting, and for the next 30 years he predominantly paints portraits. Portraits are lower down in the hierarchy of the genres. They're thought of as purely mimetic. You know, you're just painting what you see. Now, anyone who's familiar with Velazquez's portraits will know that they go so far beyond purely depicting the way that someone looks. But even so, it must have been frustrating for Velazquez to not be given more history commissions. He had a handful throughout the years. When he's in Italy, he depicts a scene of Apollo at the Forge of Vulcan, and then a few years later he gets to depict a scene from history, the surrender at Breda. But he doesn't get the vast majority of these history commissions that Philip IV is giving out. And it's not that Philip IV didn't want these paintings. He, at the time, was decorating many new palaces. He was building a brand new palace, the Buen Retiro, and he needed artwork to fill these spaces. But the problem was that he favoured another, and that other artist is Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens is 20 years Velazquez's senior when he visits the court in Madrid in 1628, and he's also already the most famous artist in all of Europe. He stays in Madrid for 6 months, and during that time he paints many, many paintings for Philip IV. And then even after he leaves, Philip is still ordering paintings from him to be imported from Antwerp. And Velazquez undoubtedly learned a great deal from Rubens, but he also was a very proud man, and I think even looking at this artist 20 years his senior, he would have felt quite competitive with that. And he was also the curator of the King's Collection, so as all of these paintings were being imported from Antwerp, he was receiving them and needing to be in charge of where they would hang and, you know, unpacking them. And so it was impossible for him not to compare himself with Rubens. So how does this relate back to the spinners? Well, the story of Arachne is not a particularly common subject in the history of art, but there's one painting that Velazquez would have been familiar with, and that is, of course, by Peter Paul Rubens. The painting is now lost. It was burnt in a fire, but this is the preparatory sketch, and Velazquez was undoubtedly familiar with the painting itself. Also, his assistant and son-in-law painted a copy of the Rubens, and it's that copy that you see in the background of Velazquez's most famous work, Las Meninas. Rubens's version of the scene is very literal. The movements are exaggerated, and it's an image that can be understood by virtually anyone. Velazquez, by contrast, has his figures be poised. They're also a bit blurred and indistinct in the way that they're painted. And he is making a conscious effort to go against Rubens. And the referencing and subverting of the Rubens painting is even more clear when you look at the tapestries in the background of each scene. Both of them are referencing Titian's Rape of Europa, this painting which was in the collection of the Spanish royal family and is one of the greatest masterpieces of Titian's later period. It was one of Velazquez's favourite paintings, and it's a painting which is very violent. It's a rape scene, as told in Ovid. But Rubens's version of the painting in the background of his Minerva and Arachne scene is much calmer. You have Europa sitting up, almost riding the bull as if she's, on a fairground ride. She's having a nice time, sort of sitting side saddle. This does the work a great disservice, and I think Velazquez thought that too. He uses the same painting as his tapestry, the tapestry which in the myth is woven by Arachne to depict the follies of the gods. And while it's painted very indistinctly, you can see Europa's arm flung up, and she's clearly in distress. So here Velazquez is trying to do that painting by Titian justice. But he goes one further. He paints in such a loose way that you can barely see the references at all, and he makes them his own. This looseness of painting is something that was always associated with late Titian works. But however loose Titian's brushwork was, he always made sure that the faces were clear and legible. Velazquez goes beyond even that. Throughout the Spinners, it is a symphony of brilliant brushwork. In fact, the 18th century artist Anthony Mengs, looking at the Spinners, wrote that it seemed as though the hand does not take part in the execution, but that it is painted with pure force of will alone. And you see this force of will in the spinning wheel, where the spokes are moving so quickly that it's a blur, and somehow Velazquez has managed to represent that in paint. And you also see it in the gossamer cobweb skein of thread, which is being held by the young woman. All these references to earlier masters link back to the subject matter of the painting itself, the myth of Arachne. So is Velazquez saying that he is Arachne? He has bettered all of his supposed teachers? Or is he in fact saying that Arachne was wrong to not acknowledge her debt to those who went before? With all this in mind, let's look at the foreground again. One way of interpreting it is that the older woman is telling the story of Arachne's folly to the young helper. And perhaps that very story of pride and skill is being played out in the workshop between the older, wiser woman at the spinning wheel and the young, beautiful woman deftly winding the thread. The painting then is both the Spinners and the Fable of Arachne. It raises questions on craft and on skill, on the idea of the teacher and the student, on the hierarchy of the genres, and on the idea of creativity and ingenuity. So in this painting, Velazquez's last great masterpiece in his career, he is staking his claim as the greatest of them all. Greater than Rubens, greater than Titian, and perhaps even greater than the goddess of craft herself, Minerva. So thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this look at one of the unsung masterpieces of Velazquez's career. And perhaps when you go see it next time you're in the Prado, you'll think of some of these ideas. Thank you very much.